Look, I'm going to say something that might sound dramatic, but stay with me here. China is far more fragile than anyone wants to admit. And I'm not talking about some distant theoretical weakness. I'm talking about a vulnerability so fundamental, so exploitable, that in the event of a major conflict, the United States could bring the entire Chinese system to its knees without firing more than a handful of shots. All it would take is a naval blockade, 30 days, or maybe even less. Now, I know what you're thinking. China? The economic superpower? The country with over 1 billion people and the world's largest manufacturing base. How could that possibly collapse in a month? But that's exactly the point. China's greatest strength, its massive export driven economy, is also its Achilles heel. And once you understand the geography, the numbers, and the sheer dependence China has on the outside world, you'll see why this isn't a hawkish exaggeration. It's cold, hard strategy. Let's start with the most obvious problem. China is boxed in. Look at a map. Really look at it. China has one of the worst geographic positions of any major power in history. To the east, you've got the first island chain, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, stretching down to Indonesia. Every single one of these choke points can be controlled, monitored, and most importantly, blockaded. The Malacca Strait alone is a nightmare scenario for Beijing. 80% of China's oil imports pass through this narrow waterway between Malaysia and Indonesia. 80%. It's 500 miles long and its narrowest point is just 1.7 miles wide. You could park a handful of submarines and surface vessels there, and China's energy supply is done. Finished. The lights start going out in Shanghai, the factories in Guangdong grind to a halt, and the entire logistics network that keeps 1.4 billion people fed and employed starts to buckle. But it's not just Malacca. The Sunda Strait, the Lombok Strait, every maritime corridor that connects China to the Indian Ocean, to the Middle East, to Africa, to Europe, can be sealed off. The United States Navy doesn't need to invade China. It doesn't need to launch a massive ground war. It just needs to do what it does better than any military force in human history: control the seas. Here's where things get real fast. China imports about 70% of its crude oil. Let me say that again, 70%. Despite all the talk about strategic petroleum reserves and diversification, China remains desperately dependent on foreign oil. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, Angola, Brazil, and Venezuela. The oil comes from everywhere, but it all has to cross an ocean to get there. Now, China has strategic reserves, sure. They've been building them up for years. Estimates suggest that they've got somewhere between 80 to 90 days of supply stockpiled. Sounds pretty good, right? Except here's the problem. Those estimates assume a normal peacetime consumption. In a war scenario, where the military is mobilized, where industrial production might actually increase to support the war effort, where panic buying and hoarding kick in, you're looking at 30 to 45 days maximum. And here's the thing people don't talk about. It's not just about running out completely. It's about the economic panic that sets in the moment a blockade is announced. Markets aren't stupid. The second it becomes clear that no tankers are getting through, oil futures in China would go absolutely vertical. Prices would skyrocket, rationing would begin immediately. The government would have to make impossible choices. Do you fuel the military, or do you keep the civilian economy running? Do you power the coastal megacities, or do you try to maintain agricultural production inland? Energy is one thing, but let's talk about something even more immediate: food. China is not food self-sufficient, not even close. It imports massive quantities of soybeans, wheat, corn, and other staples. Now, China does produce a lot of rice and some wheat domestically, so it's not going to see mass starvation in 30 days. But here's what will happen. Food prices will explode, variety disappears, and the quality of life for ordinary Chinese citizens deteriorates rapidly. More critically, China's livestock industry depends heavily on imported feed. Soybeans from Brazil, corn from the United States. Cut those off, and China's pork production collapses. And if you know anything about Chinese society, you know that pork is not optional. It's culturally essential, economically vital, and politically sensitive. The last time pork prices spiked dramatically in China, we saw social unrest. In a blockade scenario, with pork becoming unaffordable or unavailable, you're talking about a crisis of legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. Now, let's go to the big one, manufacturing. China is the world's factory, right? They make everything. Except here's what they don't tell you. China doesn't actually control the full supply chain for most of what it makes. It imports raw materials, processes them, assembles components made elsewhere, and exports finished goods. It's a middleman economy on a massive scale. Take semiconductors. China imports more semiconductors than it imports oil. These chips are essential for everything: smartphones, computers, cars, military equipment, industrial machinery. China has tried desperately to build domestic semiconductor production, but it's still years, maybe decades, behind Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. Cut off the chip supply, and China's vaunted manufacturing sector starts to seize up within weeks. Or consider iron ore and copper. China imports the vast majority of both. Without iron ore from Australia and Brazil, Chinese steel production collapses. Without copper from Chile and Peru, electrical manufacturing grinds to a halt. These aren't luxury goods or nice-to-haves. These are the fundamental inputs that keep the entire industrial machine running. And here's the beautiful irony from a strategic perspective. China's manufacturing base, concentrated along the coast in places like Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Tianjin, becomes a massive liability in a blockade scenario. All these factories, all these workers, all this infrastructure, it all depends on imports arriving by sea and exports leaving by sea. Shut down maritime trade, and you've got tens of millions of people in coastal provinces with nothing to do, no income, and a growing anger at the government that promised perpetual prosperity. Let's talk about what happens to the Chinese economy when the blockade kicks in. We're not just talking about shortages and inflation. We're talking about financial panic on a scale that would make 2008 look like a minor correction. China's financial system is already precarious. The real estate sector, which represents something like 25 to 30% of GDP, is teetering. Local government debt is astronomical. The stock market is propped up by state intervention. Consumer confidence is fragile. Now add a naval blockade and the certain knowledge that the economy is going to contract by double digits, and you've got the recipe for a complete financial meltdown. Capital flight would be immediate and massive. Every wealthy Chinese citizen with offshore accounts would be trying to move money out. The yuan would collapse in value. The government would have to impose strict capital controls, but that would only accelerate the panic. Banks would face runs. The government would have to choose between printing money and causing hyperinflation, or letting institutions fall and causing a depression. And here's the political dimension. The CCP's legitimacy rests almost entirely on economic performance. The implicit deal with the Chinese people has been, you give up political freedom and we deliver prosperity. Break that deal and the whole system is in question. Now, China hawks often get criticized for underestimating Chinese military power. Fair enough. China has built an impressive military, especially its navy and missile forces. But here's the reality. China's military is designed for regional dominance, not power projection. It's built to potentially take Taiwan, to control the South China Sea, to intimidate its neighbors. What it's not built to do is break a blockade enforced by the United States Navy, operating from bases in Japan, Guam, Australia, and potentially the Philippines. China's aircraft carriers are no match for American carrier strike groups. Its submarines are improving but still inferior, and most critically, China has almost no ability to protect its maritime commerce beyond the first island chain. Sure, China could launch missiles at US bases and ships. It could try to bloody our nose enough that American public opinion turns against the war. But here's the thing. In a blockade scenario, the United States doesn't need to get close. The US doesn't need to invade. The US doesn't even need to maintain a constant presence right off China's coast. They just need to sink any Chinese flagged or Chinese bound commercial vessel that tries to break the blockade. They can do that with submarines, with long range anti ship missiles, with air power operating from distant bases. China can't win a war of attrition when the attrition is against its own economy. So let's walk through what actually happens. Day 1, the United States announces a total naval blockade of China. Maritime insurance rates for China-bound shipping go infinite. No commercial vessel will risk the journey. Days 2 to 7, panic buying in China. Supermarkets stripped bare, gas stations overwhelmed. The government activates strategic reserves and imposes rationing. Stock markets globally tank, but Chinese markets suffer the worst. Days 8 to 14. Factories begin shutting down as raw material inventories run out. Unemployment starts to spike. Food prices double, then triple. The government cracks down on protests and social media, but the discontent is growing. Days 15 to 21. Energy rationing becomes severe. Rolling blackouts hit major cities. The privileged party elite and military get priority, breeding resentment. International shipping has completely stopped, and China is economically isolated. Days 22 to 30, the financial system is in freefall. Banks are closed, the currency is worthless outside China, the government faces impossible choices. Social unrest is spreading, the military and security services are stretched thin maintaining order. The CCP faces an existential crisis. At this point, China has two options: capitulate to whatever demands the United States is making, or escalate to nuclear weapons and risk mutual annihilation over what has become an unwinnable situation. This isn't about warmongering or wanted conflict with China. It's about understanding reality. China has built an enormous economy on a foundation of sand. It's completely dependent on global trade, on freedom of navigation, on the very international system that the United States Navy has guaranteed for 75 years. In any serious conflict, that dependency becomes an exploitable weakness. A naval blockade wouldn't just damage China's economy, it would collapse it completely. 30 days, maybe even less. And the Chinese Communist Party knows this. It's why they're so desperate to build a blue water navy. It's why they're obsessed with the Belt and Road Initiative, trying to create land-based trade routes. It's why they're stockpiling resources and trying to achieve food and energy security. But they're not there yet. And in the cold calculus of strategic competition, that means the United States holds the ultimate trump card. They don't need to match China factory for factory or soldier for soldier. They just need to control the seas, and they already do.